Good afternoon and welcome to the Garrison Militaria. Today we'll be briefly covering the M95 Mannlicher, more specifically the Austrian and Bulgarian reworked M95s in 8x56mm rimmed. But before we get into that, we need to dive into what this rifle essentially used to be, which is just a longer version of this in 8x50mm rimmed. So let's get into it. The M95 is a straight-pull bolt-action rifle designed and invented by a man named Ferdinand Mannlicher in what was once the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This rifle was in service from 1895 to the end of the First World War, which was also the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Several manufacturers produced M95s, such as Steyr in Austria, FGGY in Budapest, Hungary, and by, I might butcher this, Zbrojovka, Brno, and at the time Czechoslovakia. To add on, Czechoslovakia was the only country to produce M95s past 1918. However, production only went into the very early 20s, and these M95s were made from mixed Austro-Hungarian parts and newly made Czech parts. Around 3.5 million Mannlichers were produced in total. Some specifications of the original long rifle would be an overall length of 50 inches with a 30.1 inch barrel, originally chambered for the 8x50mm rimmed round with a velocity of around 2,030 feet per second. Standard rear V-notch flip-up sights with a bladed front post. Its weight is around 8.3 pounds. M95s, like many other rifles at the time, held 5 rounds. However, the M95 used an end-block clip to hold the rounds instead of a stripper clip, which is what you would see with most other rifles at the time, such as Mausers or Enfields. Before moving forward, it should be noted as well that Bulgaria adopted the M95 rifle in 1897 and received several contracts from a manufacturer to arm its military. At the end of World War I and the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, many M95s were given to the Balkan states as war reparations, with Bulgaria being its main foreign user. As I've mentioned before, Bulgaria had already started acquiring M95s in 1903, long before the First World War, and had continued to acquire them first and mainly from Steyr, then later Budapest as well. So in 1934, when Bulgaria adopted the Austrian 8x56mm rimmed round, they began acquiring M95s again from many other European countries such as Austria, Poland, Finland, and Czechoslovakia. In the 1930s and 40s, the majority of M95 rifles were rechambered and rebuilt for the 8x56mm rimmed cartridge, mainly by Austria and Bulgaria as well as Hungary. But before we dive into the rework history and process, it should be mentioned that from 1938 to around 1940, many M95s were sent from Austria to Bulgaria due to Austria now being equipped with new German weaponry after being annexed by Germany. Now, other than being rechambered for 8x56 rimmed, the rebuild process didn't consist of much more other than shortening the barrel from 30 inches to just 19 inches and shortening the stock length from 50.5 inches to just 39 inches. Side sling swivels were also mounted onto this rifle as well during the rebuild process. Oddly enough, the rear side sling swivel was moved directly onto the left side of the handguard, which is very impractical to some. And the prior slit, where you would usually find it on the bottom of the buttstock, was filled in with a piece of wood. The front sling swivel was removed as well and put onto the side. The rear side post would remain the same during the rebuild process, but the front side post was replaced with a more elevated one. Before moving forward from the general rebuilding process of this rifle, I should also mention that this rifle can come in 3 different wood variations for its stock, such as walnut, which was the Austro-Hungarian standard at the time, and of course, as the war went on and materials and supplies were strained, they moved to elm and then beech. So it's not uncommon to see M95s with different woods for their stocks. This one I'm holding, I believe, is elm stock. Now, let's get into some serial numbers and markings you may find on many of these M95 rifles. To start, only the original Bulgarian contract rifles that I had mentioned earlier had serial numbers put onto the bolts during manufacture. To my knowledge, all other M95 bolts were not serialized and were hand-fitted to its respective rifle. Hence why you may feel as if the bolt is rough to work when shooting some M95s. It's probably due to the fact that it's not the original bolt to that rifle. Also, as a part of the rebuild process, Bulgaria electro-penciled serial numbers on the bolt stem and the other usual parts you'd see a rifle serial number to make it all matching, like the stock, receiver, barrel, etc. On the receiver and barrel shank, you may see some different markings and obvious signs that some markings and crests were ground off and new ones placed on. This is fairly common as many of these rifles changed hands from World War I to when many of them were imported. You'll also see markings indicating the rifle was reworked for 8x56mm rimmed. Now, on the barrel shank of many of these M95s, you'll see an S put onto it. An S stands for Spitzer, which was the type of round the 8x56mm cartridge was. Now, that also is an indicator that this rifle was rechambered for 8x56 if the S is also on there. Now, with the S stamped onto the barrel shank, there may be some variations to the type of S that you see. Now, an S with no tails on the end indicates that it was reworked by Steyr in Austria. An S with little tails on the end will indicate that it was reworked by Bulgaria. And if there's no S and an H instead, then it was reworked by Hungary. Now, the original serial numbers for the stock on this rifle would be on the left side. Once these rifles were rebuilt, a new serial number was placed onto the right side of the buttstock. Now, in many M95s, you'll still be able to see the old serial number still on the left side of the buttstock, which is fairly common. Now, as I've stated before, during the rebuild process, these M95s were reserialized on the stock, bolt, receiver, and barrel. This may lead some to think that they have an all-matching original M95, but that is not really legitimate. And I say this because that no M95s were produced past 1918 other than in Czechoslovakia. And also due to the fact that these rifles had bolts that were hand-fitted to its respective rifle with no serial number, unless they were one of the original Bulgarian contract rifles that I've mentioned before. Also due to the fact that these rifles changed hands many times throughout their time in service, and crests were ground off and re-put on, and new serial numbers were put onto the rifle by whichever country obtained the rifle. I should also mention that serial numbers were reused every fiscal year. The Austro-Hungarian Empire used a 4-digit serial number with the letter A through Z following, and this serial number was recycled during manufacture accordingly. So pretty much M95s in regards to keeping of legitimate parts and accuracy, they're pretty obscure. Now, Bulgaria pretty much used this rifle from its first contracts pre-World War I through the decades following into World War II and even after World War II as their strategic reserve weapon, until the 1970s when many of these rifles were imported to the United States or sold off to areas of conflict around the world, mostly in underdeveloped countries. Now, unfortunately, the price of new 8x56mm ammunition is a bit steep and tends to draw people away from shooting it or purchasing rifles like M95s that are chambered in 8x56. Now, surplus 8x56 is harder to come by, but not extremely rare. However, most of it was manufactured in the 1930s, so many people consider it collectible and don't necessarily want to shoot it out of their rifles. That is up to you to decide, but I'm a big fan of the M95 rifle. It is a stout rifle that shoots a stout round, and I just love to have it. And thank you for visiting the Garrison Militaria.